Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Sarah, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you how to sew crochet plushies together. This is just kind of my process on how I sew things together, basically what I'm thinking about while I'm attaching limbs. This is a bigger project. This is Daisy the Dragon. I'm just going to be showing you how I sew. I don't use any pins or anything to hold things in places unless I'm experimenting with a new design. That's not to say I don't use it, but in this video, I will be showing you how I get away with not using it. Let's just go ahead and get right into it. Today, I will be using a sewing needle. So I have a couple different options I switch between. I'll use this plastic one or this plastic one with a little, like a crook at the end, I guess you could say. It's a little bend at the end of the needle. Now, I recommend when working with chenille yarn to use plastic. Chenille yarn will still fall apart when using plastic needles, but it'll fall apart a lot less quickly than if you used a metal needle. A metal needle will tear up your chenille a lot faster. You'll also need a pair of scissors to tuck in ends when we're at that point. We're going to begin by sewing the legs onto Daisy. Now you could really start any of these pieces first, but I generally just like to put the legs on because when you start sewing facial details on, especially, your yarn can tend to get hooked around them. So just to make it pretty easy, I start with the legs. Do the facial details last. So you're gonna thread your needle with your leg, and there's these things called Ami sticks, I believe that's what they're called, but they're very similar to like large knitting needles that you can use to hold pieces, especially large pieces, in place on your plushie. I personally don't have any and I don't use any. I find it kind of moves the stuffing around, and I just generally like to keep things intact. So basically how I start is I take my plushie and I'll hold whatever limb, I'll hold it against the body, and I'll just look at it and see if this is where I want to place it. So I know that I want to put the arms slightly below the eyes. It's kind of hard to show you because Daisy's so big, but just about here. And I'm just going to hold it in place, and then I'm going to start sewing. So I'm just going to go right in and just go one stitch over, pull the loop through. And now I'm just going to be taking one stitch from the body, or one stitch from the arm and then one stitch from the body, and just going through it one stitch at a time. Tries to keep everything nice and clean, and if you skip stitches, it will be noticeable when you're done, so just try to avoid skipping stitches. And then I'm just going to keep doing this all the way around. I know for Daisy's legs, I like to press them into a little bit more of an oval shape, so that's what I'll do while I sew. And for this first leg, it doesn't really matter where you sew it, because we're going to use this leg almost like an anchor point for how we sew on all the other legs. So as long as this leg isn't wildly off, you can just basically sew it wherever. And this can be applied to any plushie as well. This technique I'm going to show you for lining up limbs. But I'm just going to go all the way around, and then I'm actually going to go back all the way around one more time through all the stitches I already sewed. That way the leg is nice and secure, especially if it's going to be a piece that people can hang on to, like a leg. You definitely want to give it some extra security and sew it around more than once. If your chenille yarn tends to fall apart, you can actually use a smaller size yarn to sew the limbs on as well. Recommend a skinny chenille. That's generally what I use because the texture is similar, but you do want to use similar colors as well in case it peeks through a little bit. Generally you're not going to see it, but I believe I show that technique off in another video of mine, so I'll have it up here in the iCards. You can check it out. I'm pretty certain I show it off in that video. So once you go all the way around, I just secure the end with a nice little knot. What I'll do is I'll insert my needle into the arm, I'll pull up a loop, and then I'll put my yarn end through that loop and pull tight. That creates a nice little knot, and you can do this more than once if you really want to. I just generally do this once. And then I'm going to weave this end in, right into the body. And then if you see my more recent tutorials, then you know that I generally tuck these ends in with my scissors. I do this because I don't like cutting the yarn because it just sits in a bag and I don't do anything with it. So I just go ahead with my scissors and stuff it in. If you are using chenille yarn like I am, please be careful how you do this because you can break the stitches and break the yarn. So just make sure you're going between stitches and you're not being too aggressive with it, because I have done that before and it was not the most fun experience. Here is the first arm placed, and here I can see where it is placed against the eye. I think I pretty much nailed it, which is kind of funny because it's hard to see with the camera stand in the way, but I think it's pretty much where I want it to be. So now I'm going to move on to the next leg. Now you can start with the leg straight across and place the one over here, or you can do what I normally do and place the arm on the other side first. So just pick up your other leg and thread your needle again. And now I'm going to basically eyeball the placement of this. I put it up against the body and I see where it starts to line up against the other leg. So here I can see where the leg is, where I want to place the other leg. So right about here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put one stitch in just to get the leg in the spot I want it in. And now what we're going to do is something I like to call tracing. You can see the rounds on the body where the stitches are, and I use that to trace and make sure my arm placement is correct. Now if you're making a smaller project, you'll want to go around the top because that's what most people are going to look at. So you want to trace from the top. Since crochet is a spiral, it has a point where it like overlaps, and so you want that overlap point to be on the bottom for most plushies. Since this plushie is so big, I just use the bottom to trace instead of going over the whole top. And then I'm just going to sew until I hit that stitch, which is this next round here. And then I'll always double check because sometimes you can be a little off. Yep, so right there. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull right through. So I know this is the end of where I'm going to put the arm, and this is where I'm going to turn and start working the other direction. And then you're just going to work your way back along the top. And once you get a little bit closer, you can do the tracing again to make sure that the top part also lines up. So I know that my stitching ends here, so I'm going to trace it, and I know I have to get 3 more stitches over before I have to turn and work on the other side, that is. And then right before I commit fully, I'm going to trace it again and make sure it's lined up properly. Just try and pay attention. It doesn't honestly have to be perfect because most people aren't going to notice if you're one round off, but I am going to be placing the last stitch here before turning again. And then same with the last arm, I'm going to go ahead and go all the way around once more before securing the end and weaving it in. And here are the other arms, or the other arm on. So now we have 2 arms, and they actually look pretty even, which is nice. I find that if it's a little bit off, it's not too much of a big deal. Taking the arm off is harder, and I would only do it if it's like really off. If it's only a tiny bit off, then no one's gonna notice. Guarantee you that. So now I'm gonna go ahead and sew on the other 2 legs. Now these are the back legs, so it's a tiny bit different. So the first leg you place, you just wanna make sure it's lined up with this leg here, and that could be like going up a little bit higher depending on your plushie, a little bit lower. I'm just gonna go right straight across and sew the other arm on. And then after you place this one on and it's nice and secure, you're going to use that same tracing method to make sure the other leg is sewn on right. So you want to line it up here and then line it up here as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and speed through that so this video isn't too long, and then I'll show you how I sew on the wings, which is a little bit different, and then we'll do the facial features as well. Try and give you guys a wide scope of different pieces that I sew on. And here are the arms and legs attached to Daisy, and they're nice and secure. They're still a little bit floppy because of the way they were sewn on, which is the goal with this pattern, but you can just give everything a nice little massage once it's sewn on, and then make sure you pick off the stuffing as you work. Sometimes the yarn can pull stuffing up on the seam. This just helps you keep a cleaner sewing line. But now we're going to go ahead and attach the wings. Now the wings are a great example because I'm showing you how you can sew through 2 layers. I know this green is pretty dark, so I'm not sure how well it's showing up on camera, but there's 2 layers we're going to be sewing through plus the body. For the wings, I'm going to grab the one for the left side or the right side, depending on which way you're looking at it actually. And I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle. Now this dark green yarn is falling apart a little bit more than my light green yarn, but we're going to see how long it'll last. So for this, I just pick a spot that I think looks nice. I tend to go closer to the neck, kind of between the first couple increase rounds, and then I just sew right next to the spikes. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick up both sides. Here I have both sides on my needle, and then I'm also going to go through the body at the same time and pull that all nice and tight. And then just go ahead and repeat that all the way down. And then same with the legs, I do double reinforce, and then I actually do a little bit of sewing down here as well, which we'll do when we come back up after reinforcing the seam. Generally, I would be doing this in my lap or even on a like couch, because it'll be easier to hold the plushie. If you have a hard time sewing on a desk, just try doing it in your lap, because it tends to be a lot easier to sew, especially larger plushies. I do this so I can catch it on camera for you guys, but it's definitely easier to do this in a more comfortable position. But I'm just going to go back up through the wing every couple of stitches. I find that the reinforcing seam doesn't need to be perfect in any way. It can skip a couple stitches, you're not going to see it. And then once I get back up to the corner, I like to sew the side of the wing down as well, so it's not too loose. And then I'll just sew it at a slight angle so that the wing sits straight rather than like this. It sits like this. And then once I finish, I will be going back up again and then securing this end, just the same way we did with the arms and legs. Going to create a loop, slip my needle under it, and then pull it nice and tight. And here you can see I'm starting to have a little bit of bunching up. Thankfully it is on the last bit that I just sewed on though, so we are in the clear. Go ahead and use your needle if it's strong enough to pull the wing out and any stitches that might have been pulled a little weird out. And then I'm just going to go ahead and tuck in this end because I can't be bothered to re-thread it onto my needle. And there's that wing on. Now the hard part is making sure the other wing lines up as well. So you're gonna have to make sure you sew it on the same round on the other side. And you'll have to trace over the center scales or whatever you may have in the center if you have anything, because it's technically an optional step to add these center spikes, but I think the rest of the stuffing out. There we go. You kind of just want to take a step back as well if you need to and you can't really tell. So I can tell that this is where I need to sew the second wing on, this round right here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Like I said, I'll speed this up so we can move on to the head, because I think there are some great examples there as well. And here are the wings attached, and you can see that they are pretty much even. And that is obviously the goal when sewing onto close to identical pieces. You can see I used the tracing method to make sure it all lined up, and so it does. Honestly, this dragon is turning out a little bit better than most of my projects do, so I'm glad I'm nailing it on camera for you guys. I tend to make more mistakes on camera, but not today. So the final step I'm going to do is sew the facial details on, and the nicest part about the face is that you have the eyes if you're using safety eyes, but these are your guide, which helps keep everything even. And it's a little bit easier than trying to trace over the spikes, or if you had fluff on the top of your head like with my willow dragons, it can be really hard to tell which round connects with which round. So the eyes are a nice little help when it comes to that. But I'm going to begin by sewing my ears on. This is just how I like to start, so you could sew the horns on first as well if you prefer. But I'll go ahead and thread my needle. The ears are made up of 2 sides, and you always want to sew them on flat. I usually start by sewing the back side on first, and then coming back and sewing the middle, and then I'll go all over around once more just to secure it. But I want to place these ears about lined up with the bottom of the eye. And I'm just going to go ahead and, this is the round right before the decrease round is usually where I like to put the ears. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing there. Turn this plushie around so it's easier for me to follow. And I'm just going to sew along the side of the head until I get to around the top of the ear. Once I get to the top of the ear, I will just go straight back down 1 round in front of the back. Sometimes I'll sew this right up against the back of the ear as well, but in this case I have enough space to take over about 2 rounds with the ear. And then once I go all the way around, I'm going to reinforce it one more time, and then I'll weave in this end. And here is the first ear attached. So now I got to do the other side. Now this is where it's really important that you trace above on the top of the head rather than underneath, because if you take your hand and trace over the top, it'll look even. But if you take your hand and you trace it all the way around the bottom, you'll actually be about 1 round behind where it looks correct. So that's that spiral I was talking about earlier, where the crochet, well, if you look at it, it crochet and it spirals out, and unless you are stopping, slip stitching, and chaining 1 at the end of each round, it's going to create this spiral, so that will affect which way you trace. Highly recommend tracing over the top of things because, like I said earlier, that is where you tend to look at a plushie more. You're not necessarily going to be looking at the belly so much as the top of the head. So I'm going to go ahead and place the other ear on. So I'm going to thread my needle first, and then I'm going to go ahead and trace this round across, and I can see it go right across the spikes, and then I'm going to start it over here. And then the other thing you have to make sure you align is the bottom of the ear with the eye. This one is just slightly above the eye, so this one I want to be in a similar place. I'm actually going to go 1 stitch above and then start sewing. And then once I get the back of the ear attached, I'll do the front of the ear, and I'll sew it and make sure the same round count between the eyes and the ears are the same, or at least pretty much the same on both sides. if you do want to get better at sewing, you do want to try and make sure you continue tracing and counting, because that will help you stay even. So I count the first round that's not touching the eye. So it's this round here. Let's see if I can get a better picture for you. 1, 2, 3. So I know I need to sew where there's 3 clear rounds between the ear and the eyes. So here I can see round 1, 2, and then 3. So I need to sew here. It's also good to double check and make sure you're lined up before fully committing, because it's definitely easier to take the yarn out before the ear is totally attached. Even though I don't recommend taking Chanel yarn apart, you'd probably have to switch out the yarn you're sewing with when you do that. I think sometimes it's a worthy sacrifice depending on how off something is. And now that I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and secure this and weave in the ends. And the final thing we have to sew on are the horns. So we're just going to go ahead and do that real fast. Here I have my horns. I think I'm just going to leave them unstuffed since they're pretty small. For Daisy, the original pattern comes with these pretty stubby horns, which I think are really cute. But then also I have a free pattern mod on my Instagram for the bigger ears, which is what I'm using in this tutorial. It also includes a different horn shape. So same with all the other pieces. What I like to do, and sometimes I'll take both pieces and I'll line it up and see where I want to place them. And I'm looking at all sides to see if I like the placement here. I think I do. So I'm going to take the one that I thread my needle on and just start sewing. And it'll move slightly a little bit around, but it doesn't truly matter unless we're sewing on the second piece. And then the second piece will just line up with the first one, which is pretty much what we've been doing this entire time. Same with all the other pieces, I will be going around and reinforcing this piece. Like I said earlier though, the only pieces that really need the reinforcement are pieces that can be held or just worn out faster. So somebody could hold this plushie by the ear, so you'd want to reinforce it, and then they can hold it by the legs. They'll most likely hold it by the legs, so you'll want to at least double reinforce that. I like double reinforcing because it tends to not be too bulky, but I still get that nice security. I think that if you did it 3 or more times, the seam would probably be a little bulky, so reinforce within reason. And here's that first horn attached. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew the second one on. And while I do that, I'm going to give you guys 2 pieces of advice before you go, specifically on sewing. And the first piece of advice that I have is that practice makes perfect. And I know not everyone wants to hear that because tips and tricks are always nice. It truly is practice, and that's how I get to where I'm at now, where I can almost eyeball things without having to measure too hard. It's from practicing, and it's not the most fun thing in the world, especially if you're trying this and you're pretty new to it. It can be a little discouraging to have plushies that are a little wonky, but trust me, the more you practice, the more you think about crochet and just how it works as a structure, then you'll understand it more. It'll be easier to sew. Eventually you'll be able to just kind of eyeball it like I said already. Pretty much practice makes perfect. The other piece of advice I have is kind of leads into the same point, where try and focus on the structure of crochet. Think of it like a grid. It's not like sewing where the cloth texture is real small and you're not really easily able to trace it. We're talking about crochet where all the stitches are, depending on the yarn you're using, of course, very defined, and you can just use that like a grid. Almost like when you're drawing on the computer and you have the grid on, kind of like that, where you have those, I don't think placeholder is the correct word, but just kind of think of crochet as a blueprint, I guess you can compare it to, because if you can envision it, then you can most likely execute it. Those are my two pieces of advice though: practice, and then also focusing on what crochet looks like. And also be aware that sewing is a whole other skill. So you may be really good at crochet, but if you're new to plushies, and then sewing might be really difficult for you at first, and that's perfectly fine. Like I said, just keep practicing, and sooner or later you will definitely see the improvement. Especially if you implement different tips and techniques, you'll see improvement a lot faster. Not everything I showed in this video is necessarily going to help you. Just take everything I say with a grain of salt pretty much, and take what you can learn and use it. Here is Daisy fully finished, and if you look closely you can see that the horns are a tiny bit off. But honestly, it's not too bad because the other parts of it are even, the other sides of the horns. And then the wings are nice and even, and the legs they're a little hidden under the wings, but they are pretty much even. I hope this video tutorial was helpful. I would take everything I said as advice and adjust as needed so that you guys can work out what works best for you. I personally use these techniques every single time I sew my plushies together, instead of breaking out pins or the Ami sticks or anything like that. This may or may not work for everyone. Don't worry if it doesn't work for you. Find something that works for you. If you have any advice that you'd like to share in terms of sewing things on, definitely leave them in the comments for anyone else. Maybe there's something I could have explained a little bit better, and you might have a better way of explaining it in the comment section. Also, if you have any questions, please leave them and I will answer them as quickly as I can. With all that said, thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I appreciate each and every one of you. You are all absolutely amazing and wonderful people. I will hopefully see you in my next video. Oh, and before I go, I do plan on filming another one of these crochet foundations with specifically sewing or attaching a head onto a body. And it's not too much different compared to the sewing of limbs, specifically like the arms. The head tends to be a lot harder to sew on. So I do plan on releasing one of those in the future. So let me know if you guys are interested in that, and I'll work on it a little bit faster. All that said, thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.